So I think the design is an operational requirement because of the changing character of war. So it's the level of complexity that we're currently facing with adversaries and potential adversaries operating, below the threshold of armed conflict. So we're actually facing a very volatile, uncertain, ambiguous, and complex environment. And I think we have to adapt the way we think and the way we plan. So right now we have like state and non-state actors. We have violent extremist organizations. We have other challenges that our societies are facing, such as global warming. So the role of the military has actually expanded over the past decades. And more, the military tool is actually employed for domestic opportunities, domestic crises such as the pandemic or floods and fires based on global warming changes. I think there are limits in the way we currently conduct planning in the military. So we have a very linear approach to problem solving, where we actually establish the end state, develop some objectives, and then look at potential effects to meet those objectives, and come up with lines of effort or lines of operations and decisive points. So it's a very reverse engineering approach to problem solving. And I think it will work for a simple and complicated problem. But when you start to tackle complex and chaotic problems, then there are limitations with that linear approach. So a simple military problem would be, for example, a combat team attack, a naval boarding operation, a close air support operation, or a direct action performed by special operations. Where a complicated military problem would be, for example, D-Day, Operation Overlord, where you have a combined and joint amphibious assault, you have a para-insertion, special forces going in, you have a deception plan, you have sea lines of communication going back to North America, you have that whole logistics piece that is very complicated. But I would argue that's more of a complicated problem, very, very difficult, but still a complicated problem. When you start looking at a complex problem, I would use the example of Afghanistan. So a counterinsurgency fight in the southern province of Afghanistan, such as Kandahar, presents a complexity that is beyond, the normal planning tools that we have at our disposal. So you have to look at the human terrain. You have to look at the mess of conditions that are currently impacting the daily lives of the Afghan population. So you have to look at the tribal construct, the governance, the traditional governance versus the, more of the elected governance, the Afghan National Security Forces capacity building, police, army, air force, and so forth. You have to look at development. You have to look at governance, and then security creates that whole safe and stable environment for all of the other lines of effort to grow. So when you start analyzing the problem, you figure out that our initial focus on the enemy per se was probably not necessarily the optimal approach. Where you want to focus on the population, you want to create that environment where a young adult will not join the Taliban. You have to get him a job. You have to give him a sense of purpose. And then he will not join the insurgency per se. So very complex problem that needs a different way of approaching and a different way of planning. And this is where design has basically a lot of potential in entering those very complex problems. So I was really interested in understanding what systemic operational design looked like. It was an Israeli-based approach to problem framing and problem solving. So it was really a game changer because it got me thinking of how I think and how I plan. And there were a lot of tools under the systemic operational design that I've actually kept and started integrated into my role as the Task Force Kandahar J5. And the advantage I had as a Task Force Kandahar J5 is I had a very diverse planning team. So I had a Canadian International Development Agency planner. I had a foreign affairs planner. So one was actually focusing on development. The other one was looking more at the governance piece. And I also had two cultural planners. So I had an Afghan Pashto from southern Afghanistan, who was my cultural advisor. And I had also a young reservist who had done a thesis on the army of Mullah Omar. And he also brought that whole cultural aspect into the planning. And I was also able to leverage U.S. human terrain teams who could go down to the village level, basically integrate among the population and develop that whole terrain mapping down to the tactical level. So it's actually a really good way of approaching a very complex problem with various lenses. The first thing is to start thinking about how we think, how we approach a situation. The second would be to build a very diverse team of planners or designers, because that diversity, whether it's a gender, whether it's a race, whether it's generational, will provide you a very different outcome on your analysis of the environment and how you may frame and solve the problem. So diversity is key. Diversity and diversity of thought. As the Director General plans at the Canadian Joint Operations Command, with a problem such as a pandemic, it's definitely not a military problem to solve, right? But quickly we come to realize that there was a role and a potential role for the military in supporting our citizens. And we needed to be ready and postured. So we needed to enhance force protection, and we needed to build, based on scenarios that we developed, we need to make sure that at the national level, we were ready to support the federal government, but also the provinces and territories, should they ask. We did scenario-based planning and then developed some force packages to be offered to the government. And when I transferred to the Vaccine Rollout Task Force as the Chief of Staff, a very different problem, of course. So our focus was on the vaccine distribution with very difficult cold chain requirements, with the ultra cold chain and the cold chain requirements to distribute the vaccines all the way down to the point of administration. And again, the need to develop a very collaborative environment in order to plan and deliver those vaccines to the provinces, to the territories, all the way down to the clinical level. So a lot of work went into the planning. We did a lot of tabletop exercises to build that common knowledge of who was handling which part of the distribution, starting with Europe, European Union vaccines initially. They were coming from the EU. And then having those logistics service provider providing those vaccines all the way down through a logistics service provider, all the way down to the point of administration. And of course, looking at the security architecture, security being, misinformation, disinformation, cold chain integrity, physical security, all the way to the driver of the trucks who would be delivering those vaccines and so forth. So again, a very complex problem for us to handle. There were so many factors to consider under the pandemic that OPP would prove to be too linear again in capturing all of the stakeholders, the jurisdictions, the roles of each of the departments, the Government of Canada. It was a very complex world to operate in. And this is where, this whole interagency approach to the conduct of operations becomes important. So it's building that teamwork, collaborative approach with the provinces and territories in order to ensure we set the conditions for safe and secure distribution of vaccines to all Canadians.